Ambassador Vretson stood at the docking bay window and watched the human ship grow larger against the stars, and he could not stop his mandibles from clicking together in what his species would recognize as deep anxiety. He was Cathari, one of the tougher species in the Galactic Concord, standing nearly 2 meters tall, with 4 arms covered in dark chitin plating and compound eyes that could see in nearly every direction at once, and yet the intelligence file in his hand made him feel as small as a hatchling hiding from a storm. The file was about humans. Every species on the station had read some version of it by now, and every species had reacted with the same quiet horror that came from learning about Earth and the creatures it had produced. Humans were persistence predators who had once chased animals across open plains until the animals collapsed from exhaustion, and then they had eaten them, and then they had gone home and played with their young, laughed and slept, and done it all again the next day. They consumed neurotoxins for pleasure, including a chemical called capsaicin that caused burning pain in every known species, and another called ethanol that was literally a poison, and another called caffeine that could stop a small alien heart in minutes. They bonded with apex predators and called them pets and let them sleep in their beds. They had split the atom and then used it to destroy 2 of their own cities, and then they had kept going as a civilization like nothing had happened. The Galactic Concord had classified them as Class 12 Apex Endurance Predators, which was the highest classification that existed because no one had ever needed a higher one before humans came along. And now a ship full of them was about to dock at the Pillars of Serenity. The station was enormous, a diplomatic hub orbiting a neutral star where hundreds of species came together to negotiate and trade and pretend were not afraid of each other. And today it was more afraid than it had ever been, because Earth had sent its first permanent delegation. Vretson turned away from the window and walked toward the reception hall where the other ambassadors had gathered, and the tension in the room was thick enough to taste through his antennae. The Morvi delegate, a gelatinous creature roughly the size and shape of a large pudding, was trembling so badly that it was leaving a trail of slime across the floor, and 2 Pellery attendants, gentle moth-like beings with enormous soft wings, were huddled together, whispering prayers to whatever gods watched over fragile things in a dangerous galaxy. Even the Droon were uneasy, and the Droon were 3-meter-tall reptilian warriors covered in scars who feared almost nothing. Vretson took his position at the front of the reception line because the Concord had chosen him to be the primary liaison to the human delegation. The Cathari were considered hardy enough to survive close proximity to humans, and partly because no one else had volunteered. The docking clamps engaged with a deep metallic thud that echoed through the hall, and Vretson straightened all 4 of his arms and tried to project calm authority. The airlock opened. The first human through was a female, and Vretson knew from his briefing that this was Ambassador Diana Reyes, the leader of the delegation. And she was smaller than he had expected, barely reaching his chest in height, with dark hair pulled back and brown eyes that moved across the room with quick intelligence. Behind her came a security team of 4 humans in light armor, each one carrying sidearms and moving with the easy alertness of predators entering unfamiliar territory. And behind them came a male human introduced as the cultural attaché, a man named James Chen, with a calm face and steady hands. And then 3 small figures walked through the airlock. Vretson felt his chitin plates tighten against his body in a reflexive defensive posture that he had not triggered since his last combat deployment. They were children, human children. The tallest was a female juvenile with dark curly hair and her mother's sharp eyes, and the briefing file identified her as Sophia Reyes, age 10, standard Earth years, and she walked into the reception hall of the most powerful diplomatic station in the galaxy like she owned every square meter of it. Behind her was a smaller male juvenile, Mateo Reyes, age 6, holding his sister's hand and looking around at everything with an expression of pure delight, his mouth hanging open and his eyes enormous as he stared at the alien species assembled before him. The third was another female juvenile, Leon Chen, age 8, daughter of the cultural attaché, and she was carrying a bag that appeared to be full of colored sticks and paper, and she was already looking at the Peluri delegates with an expression that Vretsun could not interpret, but that made him deeply nervous. The room had gone completely silent. The Morvi delegate fainted, collapsing into a puddle of its own gel with a wet sound that echoed in the quiet, and 3 Peluri attendants rushed to help it while trying not to look at the children. Vretsun heard a whispered conversation between 2 Droon guards behind him. "Those are juveniles," the first one said. "I can see that," the second one replied. "Human juveniles," the first one repeated, as if saying it again might make it less terrifying. "Are they more dangerous than the adults?" the second one asked. Neither of them had an answer. Within the hour, the Concord called an emergency session, and Vretsun stood in the great circular chamber and listened to delegates from 47 species argue about what to do. The Irani syndicate representative demanded the children be sent back to the human ship immediately, on the grounds that bringing unlicensed apex predators onto a civilian station violated 17 different safety protocols. A Thalway scientist raised a point that made the entire room go cold, saying that human juveniles regularly lost their teeth and grew entirely new ones, which meant their bodies were capable of regeneration, which meant they might actually be harder to stop than the adults. A Glissari delegate asked in a trembling voice if it was true that human children deliberately threw themselves off elevated surfaces for fun, a behavior they called jumping. And when the Human Cultural Database confirmed this, the Glissari delegate had to be escorted out of the chamber for medical attention. Ambassador Reyes sat through the entire session with a calm expression and her children beside her. And when she was finally given the floor, she said simply that her children were part of her family, and her family went where she went. And if the Concord wanted a human delegation, then they would accept all of it. No one argued further because no one wanted to see what happened when you told a human mother what to do with her children. Vretsun was given his orders that evening. Shadow the children and report everything and try not to die. He found them on the promenade the next morning, and Sophia was standing at a viewport, watching a nebula paint the darkness with color. And when she noticed him watching from across the wide corridor, she turned and looked directly at him, and smiled, and raised one small hand in a wave. Vretsun froze in place. Every instinct in his body screamed that a predator had seen him, and every thought in his mind told him that predators did not wave. And somewhere between instinct and thought, he stood paralyzed, while a 10-year-old girl with curious eyes and an easy smile waited for him to wave back. He raised one trembling arm and waved. Sophia's smile grew wider, and she turned back to the nebula, and Vretsun stood in the corridor and wondered what exactly he had just gotten himself into. The first week with human children on the station was the longest week in the history of the Pillars of Serenity. And Vretsun knew this, because he lived through every single exhausting, terrifying, confusing minute of it. It started with Mateo. The smallest human child had the energy of a solar flare and the attention span of a particle collision. And on the second day, he escaped his mother's supervision for exactly 12 minutes. And in those 12 minutes, he changed the political dynamics of an entire species. He found the Glissari. The Glissari were among the most fragile beings in the galaxy, amphibian creatures with translucent skin that glowed with soft bioluminescence, and their bones were hollow and could fracture from impacts that would not even bruise a human. And they had spent centuries being pushed around and overlooked by stronger species because everyone knew the Glissari could not fight back. There was a Glissari child on the station, young male named Toby, who traveled with his parents' trade delegation. and Toby spent most of his time alone, because the other alien children were either too rough for him to play with, or too afraid of accidentally breaking him to try. Matteo found Toby sitting by himself near the water gardens on Deck 7. And within 5 minutes they were playing a game that Matteo invented on the spot, that involved running and jumping and throwing a ball made from a rolled-up piece of paper. Vretson nearly had a cardiac event when he saw it happening, and he was not the only one, because the Galaxia parents came around the corner and saw their fragile, glowing child running alongside a Class 12 predator juvenile, and they both let out a frequency of distress that shattered a nearby drinking glass. But then something remarkable happened. Matteo noticed that Toby was slower and more careful than he was, and instead of losing interest or getting frustrated, the human child simply changed the game, and he slowed down and made his throws softer, and when they ran together, he shortened his stride to match Toby's pace. And when Toby tripped and fell, Matteo did not laugh or keep going, but instead dropped to his knees and helped him up with hands so gentle they barely touched. And then Matteo decided that the best way to play was to carry Toby on his back and run for both of them. And Toby wrapped his thin, glowing arms around the human's neck and laughed, actually laughed, a sound like chimes in water that his parents said they had not heard in over a year. The Galaxia parents did not know what to do, and they came to Vretson because he was the liaison, and they asked him if their child was in danger. And Vretson watched Matteo adjust his grip on Toby to avoid the spots where Galaxia's skin was thinnest, and he said he honestly did not know, but that the human child appeared to be treating their son like something precious. By the end of the week, Matteo and Toby were inseparable, and the sight of them together, the tiny glowing alien riding on the back of the tiny human predator, became the most talked-about thing on the station. Then there was Leon. The 8-year-old had brought a bag of art supplies from Earth, colored pencils and markers and thick paper, and from the moment she stepped onto the station, she started drawing everything she saw. She drew the curved hallways and the viewport gardens, and the way starlight looked when it came through the station's crystal observation panels. But mostly, she drew the aliens, and she drew them with the fearless honesty that only a child could manage. She found her way to the Botanical Archive on Deck 12, a massive greenhouse full of plant specimens from 300 worlds, and she sat down on the floor and started sketching the alien flowers with a focus and precision that caught the attention of the archive's caretaker. His name was Oreth, a Thalway, a species that communicated primarily through scent and had no spoken language, and he was ancient and reclusive and had not voluntarily interacted with another being in 6 years, and he stood in the doorway and watched this small human creature carefully draw a Thalway ghost orchid with her tongue sticking out of the corner of her mouth in concentration. When Leon finished, she held the drawing up and showed it to Oreth and smiled, and then she tore the page from her book and held it out to him as a gift. Oreth took it and looked at it, and then looked at her, and Vretson, who was watching from the corridor, saw something shift in the old Thalway's posture, something that looked like wonder. Later that day, Oreth brought the drawing to a meeting of senior Thalway and presented it, and a vigorous debate erupted about what the gesture meant, because the Thalway had no concept of giving art, and the closest equivalent in their culture was a scent-marking ritual used to claim territory. And several elders became convinced that the human child had claimed the Botanical Archive as her domain. Vretson tried to explain that the child just thought the flowers were pretty, but this did not translate well into Thalway scent language, and the situation remained unresolved for days. And then there was Sophia. Sophia was the oldest of the 3 children, and she was the one who frightened Vretson the most. Not because she was aggressive or loud or threatening, but because she was none of those things, and that made no sense for a juvenile apex predator. She was curious about everything and afraid of nothing, and she moved through the station like she belonged there, reading the public information terminals and learning the names of every species she encountered, and asking questions that ranged from innocent to deeply unsettling. She walked into a restricted cultural exhibit belonging to the Droon, the massive reptilian warriors, because she had read about their history on the station network and wanted to see their ancestral weapons in person. And when a Droon guard who was 3 times her size blocked her path and growled at her in a voice that made Vretsun's chitin rattle from 20 meters away, Sophia did not run and did not scream and did not even step back. She looked up at the enormous scarred warrior and said that he had really nice teeth. The Droon guards stared at her for a long moment and then stepped aside and let her into the exhibit because he had absolutely no idea what else to do. And later he told his commander that he believed the human child had been establishing dominance and that he was not entirely confident he had won the encounter. Vretsun followed Sophia through the exhibit and watched her study the ancient Droon blades and armor with genuine respect and fascination. And when she asked him to translate the inscriptions on a ceremonial sword, he found himself doing it before he even thought about whether he should. She thanked him and told him the Droon were really cool, and Vretsun added this to his growing file of human vocabulary that had no equivalent in any other language. His reports to the Concord grew longer and more frantic as the week went on, and he wrote things like, "The small ones do not recognize danger, and they approach everything with open hands, and I cannot determine if this is innocence or the most sophisticated predatory tactic I have ever witnessed. And the 6-year-old has formed a pair bond with a Glissari juvenile, and I am monitoring the situation, but I am unsure what I am monitoring for. And the 8-year-old may have accidentally started a territorial dispute with the Falway Botanical Guild through the medium of colored pencils." On the 7th day, Vretsun received an emergency alert on his communicator, telling him that Mateo Reyes was missing. Every alien on the station went into a panic because a missing human child was either a child in danger or a child who was about to cause danger, and neither option was acceptable. End of paragraph. They found him 40 minutes later on Deck 15 in the Vorkathi den. The Vorkathi were creatures roughly the size and shape of large wolves, but with 6 legs, and thick dark fur, and jaws that could crush metal. And the station kept a pack of them for pest control in the lower decks. And every species on the station knew to avoid the den, because the Vorkathi were territorial and aggressive, and had sent more than one curious alien to the medical bay. Mateo was lying in the middle of the pack, curled up against the largest Vorkathi, sound asleep, and the creatures were arranged around him in a protective circle, with their massive heads resting on their paws, and their eyes tracking every movement in the corridor outside. The security team stood at the entrance of the den and stared, and no one moved because no one wanted to find out what would happen if they tried to take the child away from 6 apex predators who had apparently decided he was theirs. Ambassador Reyes arrived and walked past every guard and every alien and every Vorkathi without hesitation and picked up her sleeping son and carried him out. And the Vorkathi watched her go and did not move, because even animals could recognize a mother. Vretsun wrote his final report for the week that night, and it was only 1 line long. "We cannot contain them, and I am beginning to think we should not try." 3 weeks after the humans arrived on the Pillars of Serenity, the station had settled into something that almost resembled a routine, with the key difference that every species on board now organized their daily schedules around the locations of 3 human children, the way prey animals on a savanna organized their movements around a waterhole where predators liked to drink. Vretsun had grown used to his role as shadow and guardian and reluctant tour guide, and he had learned things about human children that no intelligence file had ever mentioned, like the fact that they needed to eat roughly every 3 hours, or they became emotionally unstable, a condition humans called being hangry, or that they required a specific ritual called bedtime that involved stories and darkness and a particular soft object, or they could not enter their sleep cycle. He had also learned that human children produced an astonishing volume of noise at all times, and that the only thing louder than a happy human child was an unhappy one, and he had filed this information under the category of things that kept him awake at night. But the routine was manageable, and Vretson was beginning to think that perhaps the galaxy had overreacted to the presence of human juveniles. And then the incident happened, and he realized the galaxy had not overreacted at all, not even a little. It began in the Central Market. The Central Market was the commercial heart of the station, a vast open space spanning 3 decks, where merchants from across the galaxy sold everything, from exotic foods to rare minerals to technology that was probably illegal in at least 4 systems. And it was always crowded, and always loud, and always full of the kind of low-level tension that came from putting 100 different species in a confined commercial space. Vretson was escorting Sophia through the market, because she had wanted to see the Pelori silk weavers, and she was walking beside him with her hands clasped behind her back and her eyes taking in everything with that sharp, curious focus that he had come to recognize as her default state of being. They were near the central fountain when the shouting started. The Urani Syndicate had been in a trade dispute with a small Pelori merchant delegation for weeks, something about shipping routes and tariffs that Vretson had not paid much attention to, because the Urani were always in disputes with someone, and today the dispute had moved from the negotiating table to the market floor. An Urani enforcer named Drax, a creature nearly 3 meters tall, with gray armored skin and 4 black eyes, and hands large enough to crush a Pelori skull like a soap bubble, had cornered a Pelori silk merchant named Yeva in her stall, and was making his position clear in the way Urani enforcers preferred, which was loudly, and with the implicit promise of violence. Yeva was trembling so hard her wings were shedding dust, and the silk she had spent weeks weaving was scattered on the ground where Drax had swept it off her table, and she was making the high, thin sound that Pelori made when they were too frightened to form words. Other aliens in the market had stopped to watch, but none of them moved to help, because this was how the galaxy worked. The strong took from the weak, and everyone else looked away and pretended it was not their problem. Vretson saw it happening from 30 meters away, and he felt the familiar cold calculation that every diplomat learned, the weighing of risk against reward against political consequence. And the calculation told him what it always told everyone: do nothing, because the Urani were powerful and the Pelori were not, and intervening would create complications. He looked down at Sophia to tell her they should leave, and she was not there. She was already walking toward the confrontation. Vretson's compound eyes locked onto her. Small figure, moving through the crowd with a steady, purposeful stride that did not look like a child going somewhere, but like a force of nature arriving. And he tried to call out to her, but his voice caught in his throat, because part of him, the ancient prey animal part that all Cathari carried in their genes, recognized what he was seeing, and it terrified him. She was hunting, not for food and not for sport, but for something else, something that Vretsun did not have a word for in his language, but that humans apparently learned before they learned to tie their shoes. Sophia walked directly into the space between Drax the Urani enforcer and Yeva the Pelori merchant, and she stopped and planted her feet and looked up at the massive alien who towered over her like a mountain over a pebble. The market went silent. It did not go quiet gradually or fade to a murmur. It went silent, instantly and completely, as if someone had pressed a button and turned off every sound in the vast space. And in that silence, the only thing Vretson could hear was his own heart's beating. Drax looked down at the human child who had appeared in front of him like a bad dream, and his 4 black eyes blinked in sequence, which was the Urani expression of confusion. Sophia spoke, and her voice was clear and steady, and carried across the silent market like a bell. "You are being mean," she said. "Stop it." Nothing moved. Vretson counted his heartbeats in the silence. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And in those 5 heartbeats, he watched Drax the Iranian enforcer, veteran of a dozen trade wars, and personally responsible for the destruction of at least 3 rival merchant houses, process what was happening. A human child was standing in front of him. A child of the species that had hunted mammoths with pointed sticks, and survived ice ages through sheer stubbornness, and split atoms, and tamed wolves, and fought wars that lasted decades, never, ever stopped getting back up, no matter how many times they were knocked down. And this child was looking at him the way a parent looks at a misbehaving animal, with disappointment and authority and absolutely zero fear. Drax knew what humans were because every Orani enforcer was required to study the threat profiles of all Class 10 and above species. And he knew that adult humans had been documented killing creatures larger than themselves, with nothing but improvised weapons and determination. And he knew that the human delegation included a military vessel and armed marines. But what stopped him, what froze him in place more effectively than any weapon could have, was the look in the child's eyes. She was not bluffing. She was not performing. She genuinely believed that she could stand in front of a creature 5 times her size and tell him to stop, and that he would stop. And the absolute certainty of that belief was more intimidating than any army. Drax hesitated, and in that hesitation everything changed. He took 1 step back, and Sophia did not move. And he took another step back, and she still did not move. And then station security arrived in a rush of armored bodies, and shouted commands, and the moment broke like a wave against a cliff. Ambassador Reyes arrived 4 minutes later, and Vretson watched the human mother take in the scene with eyes that were calm and cold and calculating in a way that made every alien in the vicinity instinctively step away from her. And she knelt down in front of her daughter and spoke to her in quiet, rapid Spanish, and whatever she said made Sophia drop her eyes and nod. Then Diana Reyes stood and took her daughter's hand and led her away, and every alien watching was baffled because from their perspective, the child had won a dominance confrontation against a superior opponent and was now being reprimanded for it. And this made no sense at all, unless human social hierarchies were even more complex than anyone had realized. The Urani Syndicate filed a formal protest that evening, calling the child's interference an act of diplomatic aggression. And then they quietly issued an internal order that no Urani personnel were to interact with any human child under any circumstances. And the fact that a galactic trade syndicate felt it necessary to issue a standing order about a 10-year-old girl was not lost on anyone. Yeva the Pellery merchant was unharmed, and she found Sophia the next day and gave her a scarf made of the finest Pellery silk on the station, woven in colors that shifted like a sunset, and Sophia wore it every day after that. Vretson's report on the incident was 3 pages long and ended with the line, "The juvenile female executed a dominance intervention against a Class 9 threat without weapons or armor or support, and I do not believe she perceived any risk, and I wish to formally state that this is the most frightening thing I have ever witnessed in my career." 2 days later, the entire Pellery delegation requested to be moved to quarters adjacent to the human section of the station. And when the Concorde asked why, the Pellery ambassador said something that would be quoted in diplomatic textbooks for centuries. "We have never had protectors before," she said, and the chamber was silent for a long time after that. Vretson went back to his quarters that night and sat in the dark and thought about a small girl standing in front of a giant and telling him to stop being mean. And he wondered if this was what it felt like to live in a galaxy that was about to change forever. He was fairly sure it was. In the weeks following the incident, the 3 human children became the most famous beings on the Pillars of Serenity, and their fame spread outward from the station like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. carried by diplomatic dispatches and trade reports, and private messages sent by aliens who could not stop talking about what they had seen. Vrethsun watched it all happen, from his position as shadow and liaison, and whatever else he had become to the human family. And he began to understand that the galaxy had been wrong about humans in a way that was far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The galaxy had feared human strength and human endurance and human violence. And those fears were not wrong, because humans were all of those things. But they were also something else, something that no threat assessment had ever accounted for. And that something was now loose on the station, in the form of 3 children who did not know they were changing everything. It started with Mateo and Toby. Their friendship had become impossible to ignore, and every species on the station had an opinion about it. But the species that cared the most was the Glisari, because for the first time in their long history of being pushed around and overlooked and treated as fragile and unimportant, one of their children had a best friend from the most powerful species in the galaxy. The word spread through Glisari communities on 100 worlds. A human child had chosen a Glisari child as his companion, and he carried him on his back and protected him and adjusted his entire way of being to ensure that his friend was safe. And the galaxy noticed. Other species began to quietly reconsider how they treated the Glisari, not because they had suddenly developed a conscience, but because they had done the math and realized that if the Glisari were under the social protection of humans, then disrespecting the Glisari meant risking a response from the species that classified as the most dangerous beings in known space. The Urani stopped pressuring Glisari merchants, and the Droon began including Glisari delegates in meetings they had previously been excluded from. And a dozen small indignities that the Glisari had endured for centuries simply stopped. And all of it happened because a 6-year-old boy had decided that a glowing alien kid was his friend, and the galaxy was too afraid of the 6-year-old to argue. Mateo had no idea any of this was happening, and he would not have understood it if someone had explained it to him, because he was 6 and his primary concerns were whether Toby wanted to play the running game or the hiding game, and whether the station cafeteria had any more of the purple fruit that tasted like candy. Leon's effect was different, but no less profound. Her drawings had become a phenomenon, and she had progressed from sketching plants in the botanical archive to drawing portraits of anyone who would sit still long enough. And it turned out that aliens loved being drawn by the human child, in the same way that they loved and feared everything about humans, with a mixture of terror and fascination, and something that looked suspiciously like hope. She drew a Pelori diplomat with her wings spread in full display, capturing the iridescent patterns that the Pelori considered their greatest beauty, and the diplomat wept when she saw it, because no one outside her own species had ever looked at her wings and seen anything other than a vulnerability. She drew Orith, the ancient Thalway botanist, surrounded by his ghost orchids, and Orith, who had not willingly been in the company of another being for 6 years now, waited for Leon at the archive entrance every morning, and guided her to whatever new specimen had bloomed overnight, communicating through gestures and expressions, since the child could not smell his scent language. Understood each other perfectly. But the portrait that changed things the most was the one she drew of Commander Grath. Grath was the senior Droon military officer on the station, a scarred and battle-hardened warrior who stood over 3 meters tall, and whose body told the story of a lifetime of combat, in the deep lines and ridges that crossed his scaled skin. And he had a reputation for being humorless and cold and utterly without sentiment. Leon found him on the observation deck one evening, and asked him if she could draw him. And Grath, who had faced down pirates and rival clans and once fought a Vorkathi with his bare hands, said yes, because he did not know how to say no to a human child, and was not sure it was safe to try. She drew him for 40 minutes in silence. And when she was done, she turned the paper around and showed him what she had created. Grath looked at the portrait for a very long time. She had drawn him not as others saw him, not as a weapon or a threat, or a walking monument to violence, but as something else entirely, and in her child's eye she had captured the wariness behind his scarred face, and the steadiness of his gaze, and something in his expression that looked like kindness. A quality that no one had ever associated with Commander Grath, because no one had ever looked for it. He took the portrait from her hands with a gentleness that his subordinates would not have believed possible, and he said thank you in a voice that was rough and quiet. And then he walked away quickly, and Vretson, who was watching from a distance, saw the light catch the moisture on the old warrior's face, and looked away, because some things were not meant to be observed. Sophia, meanwhile, had turned her attention to Vretson himself, and this was the development that he had been least prepared for. She had figured out weeks ago that he was following her, and rather than being angry or suspicious, she had simply decided that this meant they were friends, and she had begun seeking him out deliberately, sitting next to him in the common areas, and asking him questions, and listening to his answers, with the kind of focused attention that made him feel like the most important person in the room. She asked about the Cathari, about his homeworld and his people, and how they lived, and he found himself telling her things that he had never told any non-Cathari, about the hive songs that connected his people across vast distances, and the broodmates he had not seen in years, and the deep fear that every Cathari carried of being alone, truly alone, cut off from the song. Sophia listened to all of it, and then she said, "That is sad. You should call them more." And the simplicity of it hit Vretson like a physical blow, because she was right. It was that simple, and he had spent so many years being a diplomat that he had forgotten how to be a person. That night he opened a communication channel to his home world for the first time in 2 years, and listened to the hive song, and wept. And he did not put this in any report. Ambassador Reyes was navigating the political consequences of her children's impact with the skill and patience of someone who had expected exactly this. And Vretson began to wonder if bringing the children had not been an accident or an oversight, but a deliberate choice. A weapon so sophisticated that it did not look like a weapon at all. Several species had begun pushing for humans to receive a permanent seat on the Concorde, and the arguments they made were not about military power or economic influence, but about something harder to define. The humans connected. They bonded. They reached out and held on and refused to let go. And their children walked into rooms full of strangers and saw potential friends. And this capacity for connection was more transformative than any fleet. One evening after the children had gone to sleep, Vretson stood in the doorway of the human common room and watched them. Mateo curled up with a stuffed toy that Sophia had made for him out of station fabric, shaped roughly like a Vorkathi. Leon with paint stains on her fingers and a smile on her sleeping face. Sophia with a book on xenobiology open across her chest, as if she had fallen asleep studying for a future she intended to own. He opened his personal log, not his official report, and he wrote words that he had never expected to write. "I have guarded diplomats and warlords. I have stood before the Concorde and spoken for my hive. But I have never felt as safe as I do watching these children sleep. And I think I understand now what makes humans truly dangerous. Because it is not their strength, or their endurance, or their willingness to fight. It is this. They make you love them, and once you love something human, you will do anything to protect it. And that is how they conquer, not with fleets, but with open hands, and fearless hearts." He closed the log and sat in the quiet, and let the feelings settle into him like warmth. Then his communicator screamed to life with an emergency alert, and the warmth vanished. A pirate fleet had been detected on an intercept course with the station. 12 ships bearing the markings of the Reth Marauders, the most brutal raiders in the sector, and they would arrive in less than 8 hours. Fear spread through the station like a poison, and Vretson could taste it on the air, a sharp chemical tang that meant every species on board was terrified. He went to the human quarters to inform the ambassador, and found Diana Reyes already awake, and already in her uniform, and already reading the tactical display on her personal terminal. And Sophia was beside her, because the girl had heard the alarm and come to find her mother. Sophia asked what was happening, and Diana put a hand on her daughter's head, and smoothed her dark curly hair, and said, "Nothing we cannot handle, mija." And Vret soon believed her, because he had watched her daughter face down an Irani enforcer, with nothing but words and moral certainty, and the mother was the one who had made her that way. The Reth marauders arrived at the Pillars of Serenity like a storm rolling across open water, 12 warships bristling with weapons, and carrying crews that had built their reputation on cruelty and the certain knowledge that no one would stop them. They had done this before, hitting diplomatic stations and trade hubs, and taking whatever they wanted, because the Galactic Concord had never been willing to risk a full military engagement over a single station, and the Marauders knew this, and exploited it the way predators exploited weakness, which was completely and without mercy. Their leader, a scarred Urani warlord named Keth, who had broken away from the Syndicate years ago to pursue more violent ambitions, broadcast his demands on an open channel: surrender all valuables and high-ranking hostages within 2 hours, or his fleet would breach the station's hull and take them by force. The station's defense council convened in the emergency chamber, and the fear in the file room was so thick that Vretsun could barely breathe through it, and the faces around the table told the story of a galaxy that had built systems for talking, but not for fighting. The station garrison was small, designed for internal security rather than military defense, and the diplomatic delegations had personal guards, but no unified command structure, and the Urani merchant ships in dock had fighters, but the Syndicate representative made it clear that Urani vessels would not risk themselves for other species. And the Droon had warriors, good ones, but not enough to repel a full boarding action alone. And then Ambassador Diana Reyes stood up, and every eye and sensor and compound lens in the room turned to her. She spoke calmly and clearly, and without any of the diplomatic softness that the aliens had come to expect from negotiations, because this was not a negotiation. She told them that the ISV Magellan was not just a diplomatic transport, but a frigate-class warship with a full marine detachment, because humans did not send their children anywhere they could not defend. And she said this with the same matter-of-fact certainty with which someone might say that water was wet or that stars were hot, as if the idea of sending children somewhere unsafe was so foreign to humans that they had built warships into their diplomatic fleet as a basic precaution. She had already sent a distress signal to Earth's 4th Response Fleet, she said, and they would arrive in approximately 6 hours. But in the meantime she proposed a joint defense. The Magellan would engage the pirate fleet in space, while the Droon warriors and station security defended the interior choke points against any boarding attempts. All she asked in return was that someone watch the children. Every single species in the room volunteered at the same time. The next 2 hours were organized chaos as the station transformed from a place of diplomacy to a place of war. And Vretsun found himself assigned to the most important duty on the entire station: guarding the shelter where the children would wait. The shelter was the most fortified room on the station, deep in the core of the structure, behind blast doors and reinforced walls. And by the time Vretsun arrived, it was already surrounded by an absurd collection of guards from every species that had offered to help, including 4 Droon warriors, 6 Cathari soldiers, a squad of Peluri who had no combat training but refused to leave, and 3 Vorkathi who had followed Mateo's scent from the lower decks, and stationed themselves at the entrance, like ancient guardians, carved from muscle and fury. The children arrived with a human marine escort, and Vretsun watched them enter the shelter and tried to read their faces. Mateo was scared, and he was not hiding it, because he was 6, and did not yet know how to hide what he felt. and his eyes were wide, and his lip was trembling. He was holding Toby's hand, because the Glyssari child had been brought to the shelter by his parents, and Matteo had gone straight to him. And the two boys sat together in the corner, and Matteo put his arm around Toby, and whispered things that Vret's could not hear, but that made the little Glyssaris trembling slow. Leon was sitting against the wall, with her bag of art supplies open, drawing, because it was what she did when the world became too much and she needed to make sense of it. And her hands were shaking, but the lines she put on paper were steady, and she was drawing the Droon warrior who stood closest to her, capturing his massive form and his ready stance, and the way his hand rested on his weapon with practiced ease. Sophia sat next to Vret's. She did not speak for a long time, and he did not speak either, and they sat together in the silence of the shelter, while somewhere above them the Magellan undocked and turned its weapons toward 12 pirate ships. The battle began with a sound that traveled through the station's superstructure like distant thunder. The vibration of weapons fire transmitted through metal and ceramic, and the bones of a structure that had never been designed to be a battleground. Vret's received updates on his communicator, and pieced together what was happening outside. The Magellan had launched like a predator, leaping from cover, and engaged the pirate fleet with a ferocity that the station's tactical officers could barely track. And the human ship was not fighting the way other species fought, carefully and with calculated retreats and measured responses. It was fighting the way a mother animal fights when her young are threatened, with total commitment and absolute disregard for its own safety. 2 pirate ships were disabled in the first exchange, and a third took heavy damage, but the remaining 9 regrouped and pressed the attack, and the Magellan took hits that would have sent any other diplomatic vessel running, but it did not run, because running meant leaving the station, and leaving the station meant leaving the children, and that was not something a human ship could do. The pirates got smart and split their fleet, sending 2 ships to attempt a breach of the station, while the rest kept the Magellan occupied, and the breach alarm sounded through the shelter like a scream, and Vret soon felt the children tense beside him. They came through docking port 7 on deck 9, Marauder shock troops in heavy armor carrying weapons designed to intimidate and destroy. And they expected the terrified resistance of a civilian station, and what they found instead was Commander Grath and his Droon warriors standing shoulder to shoulder with human marines in the corridor. The fighting was brutal and close and desperate, and the Droon and the humans fought together like they had trained together for years instead of hours. Because that was the Droon way, and the human marine sergeant fought beside him, because that was the human way. And between them they held the corridor like a wall that would not break. Grath fought with Leon's portrait tucked inside his armor, against his chest, because the child had seen something in him that was worth keeping, and he intended to prove her right. On deck 12 another group of pirates breached, and ran straight into the Vorkathi, who had been prowling the corridors since the battle started, and who did not understand politics or diplomacy, but who understood very clearly that their small human friend was somewhere below, and that these intruders were a threat to him, and the sounds that came from deck 12 were enough to make the pirates on deck 9 reconsider their life choices. In the shelter, Sophia looked up at Vret's, and her dark eyes were steady and serious and older than a 10-year-old's eyes should be, and she asked him a question. "You scared?" Vret's considered lying, and then decided that this child deserved honesty, because she had given him nothing less since the day she arrived. "Yes," he said. Sophia reached out and took his massive clawed hand in both of her small ones, and his chitin and her skin, his 4 fingers and her 5, alien and human, and she held on and said, "It is okay, my mom always comes back." And Vret's, who had served the Kethari Dominion for 30 years, and faced enemies that would make most species weep with terror, felt his fear ease, because the child believed what she said, and her belief was so complete and so unshakable that it became contagious, and he believed it too. The battle turned. The Magellan crippled the pirate flagship with a strike that the tactical officers later described as either brilliant or insane. Driving straight at the larger vessel and firing at point-blank range in a maneuver that no sane species would attempt, but that humans apparently considered a reasonable tactical option. The pirates on the station were pushed back and overwhelmed, caught between Droon fury and human stubbornness and the Vorkathi, who had decided that today was a good day to remind the galaxy that they were not pets. The pirate fleet broke. The remaining ships turned and ran, scattering into the dark between stars. And they ran not just because they were losing, but because they had realized what they were fighting against. Not a station, or a fleet, or a military force, but something far more dangerous. Humans who were protecting their children. Earth's fourth response fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel 3 hours ahead of schedule. And Vreth's son learned later that when the fleet admiral had received the distress signal and learned that children were aboard the station, she had ordered the engines pushed beyond every safety limit because 3 hours was too long to leave human young in danger. Had obeyed because they agreed. The aftermath was quiet, in the way that the space after a storm is quiet, filled with the echoes of what had happened, and the slow realization that it was over. The children emerged from the shelter into a station that was battered but whole, and Mateo ran immediately to find the Vorkathi and make sure they were all right. And when he found them on deck 12, surrounded by the evidence of their ferocity, he threw his arms around the largest one and buried his face in its fur and said thank you. And the creature that had just torn through armored pirates with its jaws licked the top of his head gently. Leon walked through the corridors, giving drawings to every soldier she passed, human and alien alike. Quick sketches she had done in the shelter during the battle, each one capturing something true and real about its subject. And the warriors who took them held them like precious things, because they were. Sophia found her mother in the shelter. Command center, bruised and exhausted, and still standing, because humans did not stop standing until everyone they loved was safe. And Diana Reyes knelt and wrapped her arms around her daughter, and held her, and Sophia held her back, and neither of them said anything, because they did not need to. 1 week later, the Galactic Concord held an emergency session to vote on humanity's permanent membership, and the vote was unanimous, every single species voting yes, and the official record stated that the reason was demonstrated commitment to collective defense and diplomatic values. But Vrithson knew the real reason. Every species in that chamber had looked at 3 human children and seen the truth. Humans would turn the galaxy inside out for their young, not just their own young, but any young they had claimed, any being they had decided was theirs to protect. And those children would grow up and have children of their own, and every single one of them would walk into the field, unknown, with open hands and no fear, and they would make the galaxy love them whether it wanted to or not. The story of the Pillars of Serenity spread across every world and every station and every ship in the Concord, and it was told and retold until it became legend. The story of how 3 small humans changed the galaxy, not with weapons or threats or power, but with courage and kindness and the simple, unshakable belief that everyone they met was worth caring about. Vrethson wrote his final report on a quiet evening, while the station hummed with repairs and recovery and the sound of Mateo laughing somewhere on the promenade. Official report to the Cathari Hive Council. Subject: human children. Classification: apex social predators, developmental stage. Threat level: incalculable. Recommendation: do not engage, do not restrict, do not under any circumstances make them cry. The humans will come for you, and they will bring snacks and drawings. And a moral certainty that you were wrong, and somehow you will agree with them. Additional note: I have requested a permanent extension of my assignment to the Pillars of Serenity, effective immediately, because someone needs to keep an eye on these children, and I find that I cannot imagine being anywhere else. Stars protect us all." He closed the file and walked to the promenade where Sophia was waiting for him with a book about Cathari hive architecture that she wanted him to explain. And Matteo was teaching Toby a human game called Tag, and Leanne was drawing the nebula outside the viewport in colors that no human had ever used before, because she had mixed her earth pigments with Thalway botanical dyes and invented something entirely new. Vrethson sat down next to Sophia and began to explain the book, and the galaxy turned around them, vast and dark and full of wonders. And 3 human children sat at the center of it, like small bright stars that refused to stop shining. And the galaxy, for all its fear, was better for it.